Это ваша команда отравила Навального.
There is no such a big difference between Russian people and American people, for example.
He sits there like a marble statue and just recites the Bible, basically. For me, there's too much emphasis on performance. People are fed up of the mainstream media pretending they lived in this beautiful place of perfect objectivity and neutrality.
Can you imagine yourself being a correspondent who has to, someday, who has to cover the Civil War in America?
I said, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. You sounded quite pathetic. I don't think you need to say bad guys. They're bad guys. We can all accept that. But to sit down with bad guys around the world, to hear what they have to say, to try to understand and contextualize what they have to say.
Hello, Clarissa. Thank you for being with me.
Hi, Michael. It's so great to be with you.
Such a pleasure to see you here, not in the war zone. Everyone knows you as the bravest journalist in the world. Chief international correspondent of CNN means that you are everywhere in the worst places on earth all the time. But I think that our audience knows you and will always remember your astonishing role in Navalny documentary as the person who knocked to Oleg Yakin's door asking...
Это ваша команда отравила Навального.
Could we start with something simple? Tell me about the background of that shoot.
So we have been working for many weeks, actually months, with Christo Grozev and Bellingcat as he and our investigators put together this picture of who these people were from the FSB who had been following Alexei Navalny all around Russia for many years. And eventually we felt, looking at this information, that we had a certain degree of confidence about who the individuals were who were involved and where they were currently living in Moscow. Now, obviously, Christo and at that time Alexei Navalny, who was still doing physical rehab and physical therapy in Germany, couldn't go to Russia to have a look at who those people were. We decided that we would try to go and pay a visit to some of the FSB members who were part of this toxins team, the would-be assassins. And so we had endless discussions about what time do we go, and it was during peak COVID, and is he going into the office or is he not? So do we go very early to make sure we get him before he goes to the office? Eventually we rocked up at about 7 a.m. to his home on the outskirts of Moscow. And I went with my colleague, and she, I don't need to tell you, with these Russian old school Sovietsky Soyuz apartment blocks, you have to go through the first buzzer before they let you in. And my colleague Dasha gave this sort of totally garbled explanation as to what we were doing there. She didn't mention CNN. She just said, "Oh, sorry, we need to talk to you."
You called to his apartment?
Yes, we rang the bell of his apartment. I think he was so irritated by someone ringing his doorbell at 7 a.m. that he just opened the door to shout at us. But then when we got up the stairs, and my heart was pounding, not because of the danger or the risk, but because of the logistics of ensuring that we had this moment on camera, whatever was going to happen. So we were actually live streaming from a cell phone to our headquarters in Atlanta to ensure that even if he grabbed the phone and took it, that whatever we were seeing would be captured and saved in Atlanta. And when he saw me, I saw him and I recognized him immediately because he had this unusual birthmark on his nose. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm actually looking at the face of this person who I've been studying and reading about and looking at all his movements for months. And now I'm finally seeing him face to face. And I introduced myself and said that I was from CNN. And he closed the door, but he didn't completely close it. Then the minute I said the word Navalny, boom, the door slammed shut. And on the one hand, you're sort of, wow, we got that. And then on the other hand, you're panicked because, well, what do we do now? Do we stay and try to keep ringing the bell and try to get him to interact with us? Do we call him on the phone to try to continue the conversation? Or do we do the smart thing and leave before it becomes potentially a dangerous or uncomfortable situation. It took us a while, but eventually we did the smart thing and we left and we put the story out later that day in conjunction with Christo, with the Navalny team.
Do you know have you tried to track that person? What's happening with him? Is he
We
alive?
haven't heard anything about any of these men. It was as if they disappeared into thin air. And we actually stayed in Moscow. And I look back on this now and I think maybe this was a bit stupid. We stayed in Moscow after the piece went out for about a week because we knew that Putin was giving a press conference. Then we basically were told through a sort of back channel that we needed to go. And so we did. So to this day, I have no idea where Oleg Tayakin is or how he felt about being thrust into the global spotlight with his television cameo. But I'm very glad that we did it. And I'm very cognizant of the fact that it would be absolutely inconceivable and impossible to attempt to do that in today's Russia.
Not long time ago, Ivan Gershkovich, our colleague, was sentenced to 16 years in jail.
Yeah.
Do you think that for Western journalists, now it's impossible to work in Russia, in Moscow?
I think it's impossible on many levels. First of all, CNN has someone, our correspondent, Matthew Chance, who's our chief international global security correspondent. He has lived on and off in Russia for 20 years. He continues to spend a lot of time there. But the atmosphere is so difficult, almost to the point of being impossible, for two reasons. Number one, and the most important, as our dear colleague Evan found out, it is incredibly dangerous to be a journalist in Russia right now. And I should say it's not just Evan. Let's look at so many of your friends, incredibly brave Russian investigative journalists who have sometimes paid with their freedom, who have had to leave their country as you did. It's very difficult and very dangerous to ask around about the most basic things. The second thing, which makes it even more difficult, is that people in Russia don't want to talk to CNN. People in Russia believe either A, that talking to CNN could get them into trouble and make a difficult situation for their family, or B, they believe that CNN is a propaganda tool of the US government and that we are hell-bent on Russia's destruction. If you can't have that conversation with ordinary Russians and get a feel for how people are living through this moment, it makes it incredibly difficult to do your job. There are still people there and they are doing the best they can, but it is nothing like the kind of journalism that we were able to do before.
No, I remember actually that I was surprised that after Navalny's, during Navalny's funerals, there were people who were laying down flowers and they were talking to
yes, and CNN was there.
I was really surprised that they were not afraid of CNN.
I think we were all surprised, but in that moment, and it was just a brief glimpse, you saw people's extraordinary courage come out because they were so upset or because they were so angry or because they were grieving, whatever the reason was. They felt so strongly in that moment that they were willing to take the risk to talk to CNN, but the window closed very quickly.
No, it's so weird that you were the person who was working in Kabul after Taliban took over, and it was possible for you to work there and to report from Kabul. And we all know long Soviet history, and American media always used to work in Russia, even during the Cold War, and it was possible. It was possible to get some information from behind the wall.
Yes,
and it seems like something is broken now, and now it's not like that. Kabul seems to be a less dangerous place than Moscow in some sense.
Kabul is definitely a less dangerous place for an international Western journalist than Moscow is at the moment. There are still risks and there are still challenges, and more the Taliban is cracking down and not really issuing many press visas to people. However, it is also safer than it's been in Afghanistan for decades. And so we have been able to drive from Kabul to Kandahar. That would be absolutely inconceivable, as you well know, 10, 15 years ago. I mean, maybe 15, but 10 years ago, definitely not. So yes, it is a very strange world that we are operating in, where all of the assumptions that we made about the world order are being turned on their heads. For so many years, we were told that the Taliban would kidnap and kill us if they captured us. And now we are finding ourselves working as journalists at their invitation. But it's changing. It's changing, and it's changing quickly.
Do you think it's going to change for better or for worse in Russia in terms of international media working in Russia and our possibility to get the information from there? Because I think we as Russian independent journalists can get a lot from there, but we never know how it's going to change.
It's so difficult to gauge because in the beginning I thought this is a phase, this is a moment, and we will move through it, we will move past it. But having seen the trajectory now and the ruthlessness of the Kremlin in this moment and the exodus that you are part of so many of Russia's bravest and best journalists, it's very difficult to imagine how it can go back if things stay as they are today, if the leadership remains as it is today. And it's, as an outside observer, it seems that for a long time, President Putin was interested in at least preserving the trappings or the facade of some kind of a functional state whereby there was a rule of law, whereby there were international norms that were adhered to. And after the invasion of Ukraine, I think we have seen increasingly that he has stepped into a space of not even really trying to pretend that those things are of value to his government any longer.
You've spent several years in Russia as ABC correspondent, as CNN correspondent, and you have to talk a lot about Russia in the West. Can you share with our audience what the West does not understand about Russia? What do you have to explain most of the time?
The West, there's so many things that the West doesn't understand about Russia. Obviously, there's so many things I don't understand about Russia, and I should be clear about that. But I think we really saw it after the invasion of Ukraine, after the Ukrainian army put up this kind of heroic and somewhat unexpected resistance and started pushing the Russians back. There was an immediate assumption that Russians won't be able to put up with these sanctions. The Russian army will not be able to meet this moment because it's outdated, it's bureaucratic, it's corrupt, it's hollowed out, and it can't be fixed. There was an assumption that Putin is on his last legs. There was a lot of rumors that he was sick. Then, of course, when you had the mobilization, it was, Putin is going to have to deal with an insurrection. And so you see it time and time again, where there's so much wishful thinking in how the West sees Russia, how the West sees Putin. And ultimately, a lot of that is born out of how the West does not understand the Russian people and what the Russian people's perception is of this given moment. And I would obviously defer to you, given that you are Russian. But when I speak to Russian friends, they tell me that the economy in Moscow is overheating even, that there's a lot of money, that it hasn't been a huge degradation in people's ordinary lives. And what there has been is a kind of whipping up of patriotic sentiment, but also very real and visceral anti-Americanism. So I think sometimes the West just misses a beat in terms of trying to see what Russians are thinking and feeling based on what they are thinking and feeling, and not based on the Russian experience, which is not to say that there aren't Russians who think that the war in Ukraine is a terrible thing, which is not to say that there aren't Russians who would very much like to see President Putin step aside or disappear or whatever, but which is to say that the majority of Russians do not share that viewpoint.
I personally have an illusion that probably that's an illusion, that there is no such a big difference between Russian people and American people, for example.
Interesting.
Because the percentage of how many Americans do not vote?
Yes.
quite a lot. And if we compare that part of American population that tries to be apolitical, that tries
well,
not
it's more
to think,
apathy than apolitical. It's
apathy,
more,
apathy, and
what's the point?
That could be the same term to explain what majority of Russians think. They prefer to pretend that nothing is happening because they are apathetic. They cannot change it.
Yes.
They don't want to risk their lives. They don't want to lose the life they enjoy because they don't matter.
Yes.
So I think Russians are not so different from other nations. From
I
other
think
cultures.
that the difference is maybe that, Russians there's this apathy that exists because what's the point in going to vote when you know who's going to win? There's no sense of you putting your life on the line. Is it going to make any difference? Is the big takeaway from Alexei Navalny's poisoning, imprisonment, and death that you can make a real difference if you are willing to give it all? And I don't know, I asked that to you rhetorically. I'm not saying it isn't the takeaway, but I'm guessing for some, the takeaway is keep your head down, mind your own business, and enjoy your life, right? And be distracted by whatever it may be, whatever narrative that has been created in Russia that people do find somehow compelling. In the US, the apathy is more, I think, based on this kind of disintegration of any kind of consensus among Americans about what truth is, what reality is, what matters in this life, what matters in America. 330 million people living in this country. And now more than ever, it seems that there's so little that people can actually agree on. And people are so overwhelmed by the endless stream of information, misinformation, disinformation, social media. There's 1,000 different voices, 1,000 accounts to follow that I think, a lot of people do say, wow, this is too much. I don't know what to do here. So I'm just not going to even listen to it. And I'm going to think about celebrities and things that are kind of easier to digest and which distract me from this crisis.
I was amazed when I was reading Twitter lately, the day when there was an assassination attempt on Donald Trump. I was surprised with, it seemed to me that the emotion I've seen the most among those people who were writing about that was the hatred towards liberal media and specifically CNN.
Yes.
It was something extraordinary. So are you slightly concerned or maybe afraid about what's going to happen to the freedom of speech after this presidential election in America?
I think what concerns me the most is this constant denigration of the mainstream media. Not only does it make it more dangerous for us, not only does it make it more difficult, but again, it harkens back to this idea of we've stopped believing in truth and that truth exists. That to me is profoundly frightening because the mainstream media, we have many problems. We have many issues. We have made many mistakes and we are absolutely imperfect. However, we work so hard to get it right. We work so hard to fact check. We work so hard to treat any given subject with the thoughtfulness and with on-the-ground reporting that it deserves. All of these other activists or commentators on X, on Instagram, on TikTok are using their platforms to divide, are calling activism journalism, and are creating an information space that is totally overwhelming and not based or rooted in truth. And, something that really struck me, to bring back Russia again, after Alexei Navalny was poisoned, the Kremlin didn't come out with one counter narrative. Okay, they didn't say, no, Alexei wasn't poisoned. What actually happened was he had a spleen that burst on the plane and he went into a coma. No, it was one day this happened. The next day it was drug abuse.
He drank too much.
He drank too much. I mean, there were 20 different reasons that were put out there. What is the goal of that? It's actually a much more cynical thing than just trying to persuade someone else that this happened. What you're trying to do is bombard people with so many versions of the truth that people just throw up their hands and say, you know what, we're never going to know what the truth is. And because we're never going to know what the truth is, we need the protection of totalitarianism. This is something that Hannah Arendt wrote about as well. When you're willing to forego the idea as a society that truth exists, you are in very, very dangerous times. And so I don't think that that applies just to journalists. I think that applies to everybody.
But in this situation, is the good old professional, unbiased journalism still relevant? Or maybe it's, because a lot of people consider mainstream media to be not so unbiased,
Yes.
to be so much pro-Biden and so much anti-Trump.
Right.
So we all hear a lot of
Yes.
Speculations about activist journalism
Yeah.
versus unbiased journalism, and
Yeah.
activist journalism seems to be working much better because
Yes.
a lot of people, a lot of bloggers are working as journalists, and they are not unbiased, and they are not ashamed of that.
No. And I think that, listen, I get it. People are fed up of the mainstream media pretending that they lived in this beautiful place of perfect objectivity and neutrality. We understand that that is not true, that is not possible even. Of course we have biases. Of course we have prejudices. Of course we're informed by our politics, our education, our upbringing, our nationality. And it's not just about what's happening in the US, it's about many different conflicts that are playing out across the world. So we have to accept that. And yet, I think we will continue to be relevant because at the end of the day, if you really want to know what happened when, let's say when Trump was shot on stage and why the Secret Service wasn't already aware of this man on the roof, and you have to accept that even if there are biases involved, an organization like the New York Times or CNN or the Washington Post or whoever it may be will deliver you facts. They may couch them in a certain way. They may have a different kind of synopsis of what those facts mean, but they will be factual. They're not going to say that it was a conspiracy theory or something to that effect.
No, why not?
So I think
they can. Everyone can say everything is a conspiracy.
Yes, but hopefully CNN and the New York Times will not say that unless they have very concrete facts at their disposal that make it clear that it was for some reason. So I think there will always be a need for that. And it may be, as frightening as it is, that things need to get so much worse before people realize what a vital service journalists are providing. And that there is a difference between someone sitting on their computer talking about the withdrawal from Afghanistan and someone who's actually on the ground in Afghanistan and talking to Afghans. Now, the other thing you see happening, which is basically a plus, is local journalists in Afghanistan and Gaza and however many other places.
And in Russia.
Are increasingly telling their own stories, right? And who needs a Western journalist to come in and tell me about my own country? And absolutely, that is a hugely important part. And I think that local journalism and international journalists should be working hand in hand. But at the end of the day, I am probably better able to tell a story to an American audience than someone in Afghanistan who has never been to America. It doesn't mean I know the country better. I certainly don't. It doesn't mean I am a better journalist. It just means I understand the audience that I'm talking to. And so I do feel it's this hugely challenging moment. And yet I feel that all of us play an important role. And I hope that people will continue to understand just how vital it is.
You are the only Western journalist, the only celebrity Western journalist to have worked in Gaza during the last months. It's very hard for me even to ask you because this issue is so polarized and our audience is so polarized and your audience is so polarized about that. And half of the audience blames you for being anti-Semitic. Another half blames you for being pro-Palestinian.
Yes.
And it's like, how is it possible to work when anything that you say is an explosion?
This is the hardest conflict I have ever covered. Firstly, because it is a conflict that has been many decades. And people are so divided, are so entrenched in their views, that it's very difficult, no matter what you're reporting, to really kind of make an impact or get people to maybe look at something a different way. The second reason it is impossible to cover properly is because we have not been allowed to go into Gaza other than a very small number of embeds with the IDF and my one trip to a UAE field hospital. One trip in 9 months for 3 hours. How can we tell the stories of what's happening in Gaza without being on the ground? Well, we can rely and should and have been on the extraordinary work of journalists inside Gaza. But again, coming back to this idea, that work should complement the work that an international journalist does as well to tell that story to their audience. So it's been incredibly difficult to humanize the situation. It's been incredibly difficult in cases to get to the bottom of an incident. And you're making phone calls, there are phone outages, you have cell phone footage, you weren't there, you didn't see it, you need to geolocate it. It's just layer upon layer of challenge and complexity that I really think has impacted the coverage. I think at the end of the day, you get to a point where you also accept, particularly with covering this story, my job as a conflict journalist is not to be loved. My job is not to say something and everyone's going to go like, yeah. My job is not to get hundreds of thousands of likes on Twitter or Instagram. My job is to try to walk the line and tell this story as fairly and as clearly and as humanely as is possible. And that's what I've tried to do.
What has happened to the world, I feel, and I think we see that the attitude to the Middle East and to Israel and Palestine and what's happening in Gaza has changed a lot. I worked as a war correspondent in the Middle East, including Palestine and Israel, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I was really frustrated most of the time because it seemed to me that no one cares.
Yeah.
The outside world not really cared a lot about what was happening.
Yes.
It was somewhere on the outskirts
Yes.
of the global media, of the newspapers. In Russia, it was even less important than in the West. And now it seems completely different. Now, somehow, what's happening in Gaza here in America is very visible and very discussed. It has become very important issue. Some people explain that with the great growth of anti-Semitism. What do you think? Why that topic has become such a crucial? Finally, probably it deserves it.
I think that for a long time, everybody was hoping, and I say everybody, certain people in powers were hoping that the Palestinian question was just going to go away and that people just couldn't, their heads hurt from thinking about it for so many years and no one had a good solution or a working solution. And so the status quo just kind of limped along. You had things like the Abraham Accords, which were significant, and the UAE normalizing its ties with Israel. But basically, the problem with the Abraham Accords from the perspective of the Palestinians is that they didn't have a seat at the table. They weren't part of the conversation. And so with October 7th, which was absolutely horrific, and I was there on the ground reporting in the aftermath of that as well. But what Hamas really wanted to do was force this issue on to the forefront of the agenda, the front page of every newspaper. And in that respect, they were successful. It is now understood that the world cannot ignore the Palestinian question, not just the crucial question in the short term of how do you avert a war between Hezbollah and and Israel in the northern border, or the question of what on earth do you do with Gaza in terms of famine, death, destruction, no real sense of what the plan is for the day after. So there has been a kind of acceptance that never again can there be a situation in which this giant festering wound of many, many decades is completely ignored or looked over. Hamas or no Hamas, I think there's a broader recognition that there needs to be a long-term, more sustainable solution that will allow both the Israelis and the Palestinians to live in dignity and security.
Your job is very hard, I think, because you have to talk about very complicated issues.
Yes.
Many people don't care about.
Yes.
And sometimes you're covering people your audience doesn't suspect about their existence.
Yes.
For example, your latest report about detention centers in Syria.
Yeah.
A lot of people, a lot of children, who are just stuck there, who are imprisoned there for no reason, without any explanation.
Yeah.
I see perfectly well that if the material like that turns up in Russia, you would be sentenced for justification of terrorism, because that's like you're trying to watch the world through their eyes.
Right. I think there is, in many places, a resistance to sit down with bad guys. And in the case of ISIS, I don't think you need to say bad guys. They're bad guys. We can all accept that. But to sit down with bad guys around the world, to hear what they have to say, to try to understand and contextualize what they have to say, and to listen. We don't want to listen to people who don't agree with us. We don't want to listen to people who pose a threat. Now, I'm not saying you just give an open platform, but you have to sit and listen and understand. Otherwise, you can't make informed decisions about how to respond to any given threat. And my job as a journalist is not to be a judge or a jury. My job is to present the case and let people decide for themselves what they take away from that, or what they would like to see transpire as a result of the information that they have on any given issue.
Would you like to interview Vladimir Putin?
I actually think everyone wants to interview Putin. I really don't want to interview Putin because I think it's a poison chalice. I think that Tucker Carlson saw that for himself when he sat there for 45 minutes and was lectured about the Lithuanian duchy before he even really got to get one word in.
He was brave enough to ask, how is it relevant to what's happening right now in Ukraine?
And this is someone who's perceived by Putin as being friendly, right? Putin wants to run the show with any journalist, with any Western journalist, frankly, with any interlocutor at all. And he's going to use whatever tools are at his disposal to ensure that he maintains control the whole time. I interviewed Sergei Lavrov many years ago, and he basically, in the beginning, looked at my knee and just started talking. I only had 15 minutes with him. He started talking, and he didn't stop, and he didn't stop, and he didn't stop. He just kept, and I realized he's going to talk for 15 minutes. He's just going to talk until the interview ends. So I had to interrupt him. It was a little uncomfortable. Then I had to interrupt him again, and then I had to challenge him again. Never looked at me. Never. Just looked at my knee. And then at the end of it, he stood up and he said, I said, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. You sounded quite pathetic. And of course, in the moment, you don't have time to think on your feet. So you're just like, what do I say? And so, but the big takeaway from that was not just that he was constantly trying to control everything, but also that he didn't say anything very interesting. And this is what I find with most of the interviews I've seen with President Putin.
That's what's called
always like a power play
in this country.
Yeah, it's a and what does he say that's interesting? Does he ever speak candidly? Does he ever tell you, this is really why this is important, Clarissa? This is what you're not getting right. No, he sits there like a marble statue and just recites the Bible, basically. And so for me, there's too much emphasis on performance. And maybe for print, take away the camera, get some access where you can spend the day with this man. Would that be interesting? Yes, maybe. Would I like to spend time with President Putin? Would I like to understand him better? Would I like to gauge what he's like as a person? Yes, but I can also, even hearing myself say it, I'm like, how spectacularly naive that sounds.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think
Would you like to interview him?
no, because I think that I know all the answers.
Yes. Yes.
I can write them all.
Yes.
I've heard so many interviews and I know everything he has to say.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
And I remember rejecting the ideas of several interviews, just knowing that, I don't want it to be lied once again.
Yeah.
You worked in Ukraine right after the beginning
Yes.
of invasion. What's your take on what's going to happen after the elections, and what could happen?
It really depends who wins, obviously. I don't think we know exactly what would happen if, and again, we don't even know who the Democratic nominee is going to be yet. So it's difficult to say. But certainly we know from former President Donald Trump that he has a very particular view of Ukraine, that he said he's going to solve it in 24 hours, that he has talked about the importance of making a deal, whatever that deal would look like. I did find it interesting talking to some Ukrainians recently, and they were telling me about some polling that has been done, whereby more and more Ukrainians are willing to have a conversation, at least, about letting go of Donbass or giving away parts of Donbass in exchange for real ironclad guarantees of security to the rest of the country, which would probably have to come in the form of some kind of a bilateral agreement with the US or an agreement with NATO or something.
Closing airspace,
Yes,
probably?
exactly. Is that what Donald Trump has in mind? I just don't know. I'm not sure that Donald Trump knows at this stage. But I think the other scenario that seems more likely, perhaps, is this continues to grind on, a war of attrition, and both sides start to lose steam a little bit. I think that Russia is willing to keep going and going, but maybe they can't sustain the current level, just in terms of weaponry even. The Ukrainians certainly, if they don't have the full force of US support, cannot withstand and sustain it. And so maybe you would see some kind of a frozen front line like we saw in Korea, North Korea, South Korea, where there's no official peace treaty, there's no official settlement, but there's not active fighting any longer. There's some kind of an armistices. So I don't know is the answer, but I think for very many people in Ukraine right now, this is a very frightening moment.
I think for many people in Ukraine, it's a frightening moment, partially because they are not sure if the world still cares about them.
And this is the thing about liberal democracies and the West. They have a short attention span, and they're fickle. And they have a new problem or a new passion or a new thing that they need to think about. And what starts out as full throttle, full force support starts to dwindle into, oh, but how long? Oh, but do we really? Oh, but where does this lead to? Oh, but taxpayer money. Oh. You can feel it happening already, more so in the US than in Europe, but even in Europe, there are more conversations from people or parties that are not interested in supporting Ukraine the way that the West has been up until this point. So that's a very real consideration, and it's a very difficult one for Zelensky to contend with, right? Because how do you change that? How do you impart to people the importance of supporting Ukraine in a way that you haven't already been doing for 2 years? I mean, Zelensky has been on every single television channel. There is no one in the world who hasn't seen, well, I'm being facetious, but everyone's seen a Zelensky interview. Everyone has heard his message. And so that's the challenge now. It's like, how do you keep this story fresh, relevant, vital, and important when a lot of people are kind of not moving on, but moving away, moving aside?
Do you see the possibility of next American president starting negotiations with President Putin and shaking hands with him, sitting with him, or the point of no return has been passed and he's such a villain in the Western point of view? So
I think the whole thing with Donald Trump is you just don't know. You do not know. And maybe that unpredictability could be harnessed with certain foreign policy questions in a positive way, maybe. It is entirely possible that you could see him shaking hands with Vladimir Putin and enjoying some kind of a summit. You had talked about how Putin would love to have a Yalta 2.0. I think Donald Trump would quite like that as well in many ways. But it's also possible that he does something really unexpected. I just don't think we know. And again, coming back to the crucial issue, which is maybe what is a little concerning to many about a second Trump presidency, I don't think Donald Trump knows.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that you have a lot of time to watch movies. But
I do love movies, though.
Oh, have you watched Civil War?
I haven't. I have heard about it, and I have heard that I need to watch it because it is about a female war correspondent, a photographer.
Played by Kirsten Dunst.
Yes.
Who looks quite like you in the movie.
Thank you.
And that's the story about the Civil War in America.
Mm.
So can you imagine yourself being a correspondent who has to cover the Civil War in America?
I can certainly imagine having to cover civil unrest here and violence and riots and killing. A full-blown civil war, that is harder for me to wrap my head around. But I definitely see from my experience covering war and civil wars for 20 years that there are so many of the warning signs already there. The mass dehumanization of each other. That person thinks this, therefore they're an idiot, therefore they're a homophobe, therefore they're whatever it is. The sort of, what happened on January 6th? The facility with which people move to violence to settle a political, it's not even a political dispute, basically to try to force their will and take over and hijack the democratic process and have their own insurrection. So we're living in uncharted waters already. And I don't think we can be so cavalier as to blithely assume that there will never be a civil war in the US. But I very much hope that that would never happen. And I very much believe that there are enough good people and enough sane people to prevent it from happening.
Thank you, Clarissa, for being such a professional, for your bravery, and for your sincerity.
Thank you, Mikhail, and thank you for your incredible work and your extraordinary bravery. Really, it's been a pleasure.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you.